review and wrap up our discussion of Camus. Transition into Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche, or Nietzsche. Nietzsche. There's many different ways of saying it. Actually, there's one right way, but many different perspectives, if I can jump to Nietzsche's philosophy of saying his own name. And then I hope to say a little bit about next class and jump ahead, talk a little bit about Sartre's reading from Being and Nothingness. It's a long chapter. I posted the PowerPoint slides to that reading already. I will not be here on Wednesday. Well, remind me that you're here before I get back in, before we do the groups. Well, we'll do your reflections on Nietzsche in a moment. I want to wrap up Camus. And just to remind you, in case I forget, tell you before we leave today, there will be a sub on Wednesday. There's a lot of stuff that's, I think, difficult with Sartre. Some of it you might get right away. He's repetitive. I changed the title of the reading from Sartre so that it includes the pages to concentrate upon for next time. So you want to bring those pages. If you have access, you can use your computers, you can use your text, you can print the stuff out. There will be some in-class work on Sartre next time. I hope to be able to at least introduce that today. And then, let's see, if you didn't do the quiz that was due right before class today, that's a short answer. I'll allow partial credit for those turned in late, so don't worry if you didn't get that in on time. Well, worry a little bit. Worry the right amount. If you're not worried at all, that's not enough worry. If you're totally huddled in the fetal position over this one quiz, that's too much. You need the right amount of worry. Question about how much worry.
Partial credit for the reflection if you didn't turn that in?
I drop the lowest reflection. So that's what I do. I don't allow late reflections because the goal is to get those in before we do the reading. But I do drop the lowest. In fact, I might have changed that recently. Can't remember when, like last week. So there's kind of extra credit, right? Drop the lowest quiz. Okay, so where do we leave off? Here are some of the things, some of the approaches to answering the question that was raised by Camus' opening lines in Myth of Sisyphus. Absurd reasoning is, why continue living? When you come to, and he doesn't give an argument, he just makes it pretty obvious. He just states it as, this is a fact. If you don't see it, you're blind. You're not experiencing life. You're not recognizing an obvious fact of existence, and that is that we are inevitably going to die, and our reason constantly tells us and seeks for and questions, looking for answers. That same reason, he tells us we will never get it. And we ask, well, what then is the point of living a futile existence that no matter what it is that we do, it will end without much having been accomplished, or whatever is accomplished is basically removed with the sun's explosion. Of course, that's the more grand looking at it from a more grand perspective. So what are some of the responses to that question? And I told you he's against this conception of suicide, this fleeing from our situation. It isn't because God forbids it, although that is a historical approach. We'll see some examples of that. We owe it to society. That's not quite what he's going to say. We owe it to our future selves. He kind of comes close to saying that. In fact, he does ultimately connect both 3 and 4 together. Live for the accumulation of more conscious experiences, despite the world offering no meaning and a lot of suffering. And I think much of this he's going to get from Nietzsche. Nietzsche finds Nietzsche's conception of the importance of life, what we can make meaningful in life. It's a kind of aesthetic approach for Nietzsche, as we'll see. So those are some of the responses. And I mentioned this book. It's a relatively recent text, 2017 maybe, I'm not sure when, 16? Actually, no. I have it right here. When did she come out with this? Oh, 2013, excuse me. Totally off. She's written some books on philosophy. She's written The History of Doubt, which is looking into the history of skepticism from a philosophical perspective. This is a history of suicide and the philosophical arguments for and against it. And the impetus for this reading was a friend of hers who committed suicide that she couldn't come to terms with. It didn't make sense to her. She says, I want to say this, and forgive me the strangeness of it. Don't kill yourself. Life has always been almost too hard to bear for a lot of people, a lot of the time. It's awful, but it isn't too hard to bear. It's almost too hard to bear, which I find an interesting way of putting it. And in this text, she goes through a long history of it, showing a lot of philosophical arguments that basically say that sometimes perhaps suicide makes the right sense. But we can go back to skip through some of these arguments. We can go back to historical figures and see some of the contrasts of the types of suicides that Camus is interested in. There are those who commit suicide as a kind of noble response to, I don't know, some kind of military failure, or a response to the loss of, I don't know, the loss of a loved one, or the response to, as with Cato, who didn't do a very good job. This is quite an awful scene. He tried to commit suicide, but his hand was wounded, and he failed at it, ultimately, and then a doctor came to help him. He was trying to end his life, not wanting even to be pardoned by Caesar, but it just went poorly, and eventually he finished the job. But these are obviously cases of suicide that seems to interest Camus. Camus is interested in the existentialist question of, if life has no meaning, then why is not suicide a possibility? Within Christianity, in particular Catholicism, suicides are punished, in fact, in hell. So that's one reason not to do it. But of course, this is already off the table for Camus and other atheist existentialists, admitting he doesn't call himself an existentialist. In fact, your body would even be somewhat, I'm told they would do damage to it after your death if you committed suicide in certain situations. So this is Dante's interpretation of a suicide turning into a tree, it looks like, and suffering horribly in continuing fashion, as Dante's depictions of hell constantly showed. Another reason why we might, and this one's not quite what Camus focuses upon, but it's certainly one that's found in Jennifer Michael Hecht's argument, we harm others with our voluntary death. Some of the terms in the past were self-murder, which I find is an interesting one. And one of the concerns that Hecht has, ones that you don't find with Camus. Camus doesn't really give us statistics. He doesn't give us a sociological argument, and perhaps that's understandable coming from his perspective. He doesn't give us the clinical undergirdings of why certain people might commit suicide. But one of the things that we do know, at least from clinical studies for the last, 30, 40 years, in fact, you see this going back to some of the original sociologists, Emil Durkheim said something similar to this, is that what we do know is that when one person commits suicide, there are oftentimes others around that person. And if this is a very famous person, you can oftentimes see others copying it. And we know this. And knowing that leads Hecht to make the case that that should be part of an argument against doing such harm to oneself, because it isn't doing just harm to oneself. And then you get into the really difficult argument of, wait a minute, should we be shaming somebody into not committing suicide? Do you see the debate and the trouble with that? This goes back to Goethe's The Sufferings of Young Werther. The main character commits suicide based upon unrequited love, which happens a lot in stories, going back to lots of Shakespeare is about that. And in fact, Goethe is an idol in many ways for Nietzsche, as we're going to see, a kind of artistic, aesthetic figure, as opposed to the rational, philosophical figure. But what happened terribly was there was a rash of suicides of people who read this text. It had that much influence on so many people. And there are a lot of stories about this, of this kind of impact of others on others. So that's one of the things that she focuses upon, more so at least than Camus. Camus doesn't seem to even consider that as a concern. And then Socrates, some of you know he committed suicide, but that's not clear cut. I mean, he did commit suicide because he was, well, he could have left, but the state, ultimately, the democracy condemned him to death. The laws of the state were such that he felt compelled philosophically to follow them. He could have escaped, but he chose not to. For him, suicide is taking away something from the gods. The body, the self, is the property of the gods, and if you take it by suicide, you've taken away from the property of the gods. That's one interpretation from Socrates. But willfully committing suicide is, of course, a little bit different. In this case, committing suicide because one is condemned is different than committing suicide based upon an attempt at fleeing from one situation. And then you find Aristotle's conception of it, which is in a way similar to Socrates. You're acting unjustly toward the city. You're doing harm to others. And I think this is really, prior to data on this matter, this is really what Hecht is arguing for in her book Stay, is that it does damage to others, it does damage to the state. And you find it in various manifestations. John Donne, in his famous poem, "No man is an island, a tyrant to himself. Any man's death diminishes me because I am involved in mankind." That's also something we'll find with Jean-Paul Sartre again. Something we introduced briefly with his existentialism is a humanism, and we'll return to it again next time with Being and Nothingness. So why is it that we should stay, according to Camus? Stay as opposed to not commit suicide. Excuse me. In one of his early works called Nuptials, he says this: "There is no superhuman happiness, no eternity outside of the curve of the days. I can see no point in the happiness of angels." And his point is, I don't rely upon hope, this happiness of angels. This is something that we don't know. It's not at all absolute in any way, shape, or form, but what is absolute, in the sense that we can be certain of it, is this particular life. And what does hope do? And here he's borrowing from Friedrich Nietzsche. Hope diminishes this life. It makes this particular life, and all of its tragedy, but all of its vicissitudes and goodness and joy and the feeling of sun, and I mean that in the most minuscule sense, in the most day-to-day, mundane, quotidian sense. That's what Camus is talking about. When it's cold, like you might feel cold in a few minutes because the air conditioner's kicking, because it's better for your brain. Then you go outside and you stand in the sun. That tiny little bit of feeling nice, that nice warmth from the sun, it is not trivial. It's a minimal example, but it is not a trivial one. When I look to the afterlife, that may or may not be the case, through hope, as he puts it. Whoops, that's what's supposed to be. What? I don't know why there's a cat there to begin with. That was supposed to be showing that he's not concerned with hope. He says, if this myth is tragic, that is because, says Sisyphus, his hero is conscious. Where would his torture be indeed if at every step the hope of succeeding upheld him? I mean, doesn't that sound like a positive? What in the world is he talking about? Why is hope such a bad thing? For the same reason that Nietzsche thinks it's a problem, that it leads to nihilism. Nihilism, nothingness of this life. It is a life-denying attitude, this concept of hope. Camus borrows this from Nietzsche. He doesn't give him a whole lot of credit, but it's fairly obvious that's what he's doing. In fact, he's using Nietzsche's language ultimately in a way that I guess he assumed he didn't have to reference directly, although he does mention Nietzsche at times. And there again is his concept of consciousness, and this term we've used before, lucidity of consciousness, this clarity, this recognition of one's particular state, something that we don't have in non-human creatures. I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. He says, I'm interested not so much in absurd discoveries as in their consequences. And demonstrating, and of course not arguing, that the attitude towards life that would deter suicide. So this attitude is one of, what is the attitude? What is Sisyphus' attitude with respect to his situation?
Maybe like acceptance or appreciation?
Partly. I don't know about acceptance. Acceptance of what? Let's make that clear.
Of there being no alternative. So making the most out of, like, learning to appreciate what, like, the situation you're in,
Yeah.
despite it being a grim one.
Yes. And there are alternatives. He just doesn't think that they're viable. He doesn't think that they're the right ones. So he does have a kind of value system. He thinks suicide is not the right one. That's giving up in the face of a tragic life. He thinks hope is not the right way. But an acceptance, it depends on what we mean by acceptance. And what was the other word you used? Appreciation. Yes, I think both of those could be right. But it's not like an attitude of thank you. It's an attitude of, in fact, he uses the word scorn. Can you be scornfully appreciative of your existence? It's your existence that you didn't ask for, one that's not really given to you by any being of any intelligent sort, according to Camus, but appreciative of some of the things that we were talking about before with this basic conception of experience. Here's the scorn. I couldn't find an image of scorn, but I remember Dick Cheney being labeled scornful, and I thought maybe he will have a face that would represent this. Turns out he did. There it is. That's the manifestation of scorn. But there should be a little bit of a smile too. I don't know what a scornful smile looks like. Maybe it's similar to that. What do we mean by scorn? What is scorn? Yeah, go ahead. It's kind of a smirk.
It's like Two-Face.
Jeer. Looks like what?
Two-Face. Like Batman. You like close your eye. It's like
I don't know Two-Face.
Batman's enemy, bro.
He has a lot of enemies. Two-Face is just...
He's the guy with the burnt face and the coin, and he said, you live, you die. And it's the burnt side, you die, the other no. Oh, shame on thee.
Shame on thee.
Yes.
Have you seen the Dark Knight?
You made that so highfalutin at the end
Yes.
there. I felt, I challenge you to a duel. Okay. Well, two-faced. Yeah, we'll come up with we'll talk about two-facedness. I don't know why I'm trying to connect this to self-deception. Maybe it'll be connected to a little bit of Nietzsche and Jean-Paul Sartre. But scorn is it's a kind of a smirk, but it's a rebellion. It's a rebellious response. It's not. So acceptance is a little bit different. It's recognizing intellectually what the situation is and that you cannot escape it. And the scorn is a weird choice. I mean, you could rebel against your situation, like in your job. Didn't we talk about your worst job that you've ever had? And Camus seems to be saying, well, you know what, this Sisyphus story is actually similar to everyday life, and he gives examples of it. And I don't know that, if I recall, some of your reflections actually saw that as ridiculous. Others said, yeah, that's right on. But how should one respond? We can't change the fact of our demise. I mean, we could extend it, and Nietzsche or Camus would like this. Let's leave that face. I'm going to skip that. Actually, no. Why not through happy? Why not through humor? Why not through happy? Why scorn? Why anger? Yes, revolt. Yes, rebellion. I kind of perhaps get that because I understand that death is inevitable, but I'm still going to fight. What am I fighting against if it's inevitable? Doesn't that sound strange? I can't change that unless science and technology enables us to do that. You do it.
I guess fighting it in terms of prolonging, like inevitably, naturally you are condemned to an end, and living is rebelling against.
That's right.
Like entropy.
Oh, right. Yes, in a closed system. Yes, that's rebellion. It's not a rebellion it's not a rebellion against the contingencies of other humans. It's a rebellion against one's condition that can't be changed. And the word rebellion seems weird, doesn't it? I'll get a few more questions and I'll say why.
Maybe it kind of deals with action against the suppression, although of course you do realize you cannot do anything about it. It's something against the action that you could do that you can't do anything about, because when you laugh, let's say someone has a gun in your face and you just laugh, That's not gonna really
Like
change
Two-Face?
anything.
Sounds like Two-Face
Yeah, I
would
know,
do that.
right? Yeah.
No, that's the joke. What am I saying? It's the
He kinda
Joker.
does sometimes. He does laugh when
It's a good scene.
yeah. But it's kind of going along. I'll give a specific example. Let's say a Jew in a concentration camp is scornful of the Nazi because he knows that any day, anytime that Nazi can shoot him and
Right.
just get rid of him like nothing. But he scornfully still does the task the Nazi does for him because the Nazi probably deeply thinks he can't do it.
Ah,
Deeply,
okay.
he's like, I'm inputting a sense of misery into you, and then if you do it scornfully, like, yeah, I'm gonna do it wholeheartedly, and then knowing that I did it and thinking you couldn't do it is honestly, excuse my
Yeah.
German here, a fuck you to me, a fuck you to you.
Fick dich.
Yeah,
Fick dich.
literally, and it makes you feel more proud about your circumstance, that you overcame it through
Okay.
hatred, except
Yeah.
over
Well,
humor.
yeah, I think that sums up Camus
Very-
fairly well. It's a good analogy. It's an analogy. It has its limitations because the Nazis did lose.
Yes, yeah.
Death never will. And the Jews who used humor, and they did, there were many who survived through the use of humor, according to them, as a kind of revolt and rebellion against their situation, against the absurdities of the situation. Here I'm saying, why is scorn and anger and rebellion? Why not humor and rebellion? Is there such a thing as humorous rebellion? As Orwell puts it, every joke is a tiny revolution, which is false, but it's a nice saying. Why not, instead of respond to the inevitability of our condition with humor? And in fact, we end the semester with Woody Allen's film in which he attempts to do that, addressing a lot of these philosophical existentialist themes. I'm not saying Camus is wrong here. I'm just wondering, perhaps he could have thought of another option other than hope is out, suicide's out, scorn and rebellion seem to be our only options. Well, but why are those the only two? Yes, and then.
So, scorn, right? That is an interesting word. The way I kind of interpret the word is that it is kind of creating a value structure where the thing that you are scorning is inferior to you. So if you're living in an absurd existence and you're persisting through scorning it, it's like if, a woman propositioned me, right? And I scorned her, right? That's probably the most common use of the word that I've heard, like a scorned lover.
What is the, there's
so
no,
I'm saying-
hell hath no fury?
Yeah, like the woman scorned. So if you scorn a woman, you're saying she's not good enough for you, right? So if you scorn the absurdity of his existence,
That's right.
you're placing your consciousness, right?
That's what he's
like
trying
it's
to
like
do.
you're above it all.
In fact, that's what he says. He makes the rock his thing. He's above Sisyphus is above the gods. We must imagine him happy in the end. I think putting those both together, exactly what Camus was saying, or largely what Camus was saying. The question is, can we have a kind of playful, humorous, light, and in Nietzsche's sense of attacking a spirit of gravity, where Camus is all, instead of saying, hey, maybe I can actually separate myself from and distance myself from this aesthetically and cognitively, that I might be able to get something more out of life. And I think Monty Python does a great job of this too. If you don't know about Monty Python, you should watch some of this. Yes?
I think that there is a lot of unnecessary suffering that you cannot satirize and find humor in.
Yes. Let me clarify. Very good. So the humor here is not me laughing at, it matters with the context. It's humor from Sisyphus laughing at death. And Woody Allen's films have a lot of issues dealing with death. And it's a humorous attitude. Think of gallows humor. It's a humorous attitude in response to the inevitability of death. Not, I'm laughing at individual people who are suffering. And so that's, I think, a significant difference with certain kinds of humor that are used to upend or rebel against human activities, where we assume these things were structured by choices, therefore they can be undone. Humor is attempting to revolt against that. There you have the possibility of success. But the humor that laughs at death is a different kind of rebellion. Just as scorn over another person is a different kind of scorn, different kind of mental attitude. In fact, it is an attitude. Scorning another person is a little bit different than scorning one's situation. And I do still like the idea of scorn making one's fate their own. So he makes that his own. So it's no longer outside of one's capacity. But I don't know. Did you have more to say about it? Oh. All right.
Professor?
Yes, I'm sorry.
So is that the rebellion, the rebellious kind of aspect of scorn that we should focus on? The fact that, like what you just said, that choosing to live is...
It's a rebellion, in a way. Yes, it is. Unless I'm a cat. Then that's different. I don't remember where the cat was. You remember the discussion of the cat? Shoot. Did I lose that? Anyone know what page that is where he talks about the cat? Well, let me get to it in a moment. Camus' advice, lose all hope so that you can find salvation in the known world here and now, even though such knowledge is limited. Hope for salvation and meaning might also... I don't want to get too into this. This will be philosophy of religion class next semester, which you can sign up for now. Some of you, next week. The idea of a heaven actually doesn't help anyway, Camus would say. Oftentimes tied with that is the conception of hell. In fact, if hell's not coinciding with heaven, we might wonder whether or not one is in good faith with respect to this belief system. It is interesting, though, if you look at in the United States, there are way more people who believe in heaven than who believe in hell. But that's interesting because those typically go together. And the idea of hoping for heaven is not actually beneficial because for Camus, that includes the conception of hell, and how could that be something that creates or provides one with contentment? There's always the concern that one might be sent to that place. To end this, and to anticipate a philosopher who we'll get to next week, my mother encouraged one to be optimistic even when crippled with arthritis and dying. She asserted the infinite value of each instant, even if it's a suffering instant. Here, Camus and de Beauvoir are in agreement. It's the amount of experiences. It's truly quantitative. Camus is not confusing about that. It's quantitative. And in a sense, we ought to accumulate experiences. And it isn't even hedonism. It's not just, let's accumulate as many pleasures as we can. That's part of it. But the hedonist wants to ignore and step away from and hide and avoid and elude in various fashions the suffering. That's not at all what Camus is suggesting. That's a kind of deflection. Or, Sartre will call it bad faith. So it is indeed a quantity over quality, and it is not a hedonistic drive for just seeking pleasures. And then there's the cat I was wanting to get to before we did. So, in a way, this is my word, borrowing from Jennifer Michael Heck, we owe it to our future selves to remain, to accumulate experiences. And I think he also, I quoted this before, Camus is not ignoring the role of human friendship, as he'd said in his notebooks in 1942. The thing that lights up the world and makes it bearable is the customary feeling we have of our connections with it, that is life, and more particularly of what links us to other human beings, other people help carry on because they always suppose developments, a future, a purpose for us. So there you find the importance of accumulation of experiences individually, but also with others as well. And then it raises this interesting question. I don't know how to answer that. Why not then try to live forever? Why not go with some of these contemporary scientists who are trying to find ways of downloading our consciousness onto computers so that we can live forever? Or doctors who want to develop develop cures for diseases, all of them. Those who are studying the jellyfish, let's figure out how we can replicate those cells in a way that can enable us to live forever. Why don't we do that? Isn't that what Camus would suggest? Wouldn't an infinite life, providing us with an infinite number of experiences, wouldn't that be the ideal? Yeah?
The only thing I have to say, I guess, the argument I would give against that, or that someone might give against that, is that, and he does kind of mention it, like in the face of tragedy we find our most happiest moments, and in the, like, like when we were talking about people who are in the war, like every moment is like a win because against, like that's kind of the background of what I'm about to say. But like if we live forever, then it's like we almost wouldn't appreciate.
Well, I guess,
our life.
yeah, we wouldn't know it.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess it would be better. The ideal would be to live forever, but not know that you can live forever. Because if you knew you were living forever, it would.
Take it for granted.
Why would you come to class? I'll learn this stuff next century or whenever. I'll get it eventually. You think you've got a problem with procrastination now? I know I'm going to live forever. I will get nothing done, it seems. And it's not clear that the degree of increasing of it would make it more meaningful. Are longer movies better than shorter ones? I don't know.
I
It's
mean,
a
yeah,
silly
it is
example.
a difference in opinion, but to give, I would want to say a more realistic response is look, not trying to stereotype, it's just generally what I have been based off of. Look at the general older population. Do you see the general older population ecstatic for new medicine, saying, okay, cool, I can live another 20 years? Or do you find them generally saying, I am done, I can't do anything, I can barely move, I've done everything I can do, and I'm over this? Would you, it's just a matter of opinion, I guess, if it's just quantity or quality, because eventually I see people become so desensitized to something as little as buying a flower to someone, to something becoming so desensitized to riding a roller coaster to where you can't enjoy things anymore. So I know the idea of quantity to be able to enjoy stuff more and more and more and more and more and more, but as time goes on, you're just going to become more desensitized to things the more you experience it.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
what
If
if you
that's-
want quality? Is the better.
He seems to be focusing
Yeah, it's
on
a-
life and experience as such, including the positives and the negatives. And when you were mentioning the old folks, say, I've had enough of it.
Maybe
He didn't want to put up with it anymore. No, it varied. I've had a student who said this. He was what made him uncomfortable was his grandfather was like 85, not wanting to die and afraid of it. And this, it's like, what? That doesn't make me feel better. I wish they would say, yeah, I'm ready. 85, that's a long time. But even at 85, he's telling us, his grandfather's like, you know what, this scares the shit out of me. I don't want to go. And the student was like 10 at the time. It's like, what? You can't tell me that. It ruins me. Yeah.
I was gonna say something similar that like if life was infinite, then wouldn't you have kind of like the same existential
Crises
crisis
or problems?
of life doesn't end, so what's the point of it?
Yeah, I think it goes the other direction then. And so with Heidegger, with other existentialists, it's actually the reality of our finitude in de Beauvoir too, that marks it, that gives it a capacity for meaning and purpose and function. Whereas if we were to be infinite beings, there would be no boundaries to it. And it would have the opposite end. Instead of existential angst and anxiety with the drive and need for choosing in this world now, there's the opposite end of there's no reason to do anything. It's not going to negatively affect me. That would be one potential consequence. That's a possibility.
I
Go
have
ahead.
my hand as well. I was pretty much thinking about what you were saying.
All right. This is what I wanted to end with here, I think, and then we'll move on to Nietzsche, where he says, if I were a tree among trees, let me just get to this quote here. Let me go up a little bit before this. Page 51 under absurd freedom, excuse me. It says, I don't know whether this world has a meaning that transcends it, but I know that I do not know that meaning. It's a confusing sentence. And that it is impossible for me just now to know it. That's what he knows. And we can only go off of our immediacy in this case. I can understand only in human terms. This will be a transition into Friedrich Nietzsche. What I touch, what resists me, that is what I understand. And these two certainties, my appetite for the absolute and for unity, and the impossibility of reducing this world to a rational and reasonable principle, that's the absurd, that combination of those two. It's three parts. It's the human being, the world, and our conscious awareness that it is finite, that we can't stop asking questions about meaning, and that we will never get such answers. That, in a nutshell, is the absurdity. I also know that I cannot reconcile these. What other truth can I admit without lying, without bringing in a hope that I lack, which means nothing within the limits of my condition? If I were a tree among trees, a cat among animals, this life would have a meaning, or rather this problem would not arise, for I should belong to this world. I would not be experiencing this uncanny, this nausea, as Sartre will put it, or as an author these days puts it, to borrow from Camus, this nausea feeling of recognizing the contingency, which we'll see with Sartre, the contingency of our existence. That is, we are not necessary. We are contingent beings. Our existence is temporary. I should be this world to which I am now opposed by my whole consciousness and my whole insistence upon familiarity. This ridiculous reason is what sets me in opposition to all creation. And he goes on expanding on this. Whereas animals, it seems, are perfectly at home in their experiences. They're like the animals that Dostoevsky talks about, admittedly somewhat perhaps stupid, but they simply experience, they simply are. They're at home. They have an environment, whereas humans have a world, which is different. There's a kind of conscious conception of our existence that Nietzsche is going to expand on this, although he's going to want to return back to our animality, as we'll see. Go ahead, and then I'll move on.
Does he have any empirical evidence that suggests that animals don't have a consciousness that might envelope the same ideals?
He doesn't seem to care about that. And there weren't a whole lot of behaviorist studies that he would have been aware of at the time. So this is in the 1940s. I don't know what he would think about animal behaviorist studies that seem to show animals weep, that animals mourn. The capacity to mourn, to the extent that some animals can do that, seems to imply more than just a comfortable, complacent being as opposed to becoming in the world. When I'm an animal, I can exist, I can be aware of my surroundings, my environment, I can survive, but I don't need to be aware of my awareness. I don't need to be self-conscious. And you know what it's like to be an animal after the fact. When you're driving along just like how animals drive. When you're driving along and you're not paying attention to where you're going, but you've done it so many times, you don't have to be consciously aware of what you're doing. Animals probably, I think this is what Camus would say, experience life like that, without ever having any kind of executive control or self-conscious awareness. I don't think that's accurate with respect to a lot of species, but it seems to fit for the most of them. And I think it works with cats. I don't think cats, no offense, you're cat people, but I don't think they're really self-conscious in the way that Camus was. Anyway, and then there's this. I'm going to skip that. One does not discover the sure without being tempted. I thought this is fantastic. The secret of happiness is... What? Who tore that off? You bastards. And his last... These aren't his last words, but I do find it interesting. He says at one point, die unreconciled and not of one's own free will.
Is that actually the car?
That's the car. He did not survive that. And he was not driving. He did not do this of his own free will. And I presume he was unreconciled in the sense that, as he mentioned, I don't know that there may be a meaning in this life, but I don't know what it is, and I don't think I'll ever get it. And that's a kind of lack of reconciliation, so to speak.
If you jump off a bridge and then you regret it, but it's too late and then you die, is that dying unreconciled?
Oh my goodness. Probably. Wait, say it again?
If you jump, like let's say you jump off the Golden Gate Bridge and it's like that.
There's a lot of time for you to ponder as you're going down.
And then you regret jumping like halfway down and you're like, I really don't want to die, and then you die.
I don't know. You've made a choice. I don't know what Camus would say. That's a pretty... Well, I don't know. That's not... This is why handguns are such a problem. Their accessibility makes it much easier to actually go through with it. Whereas other methods, like we saw with Cato, a sword in the belly, that takes some guts. Sorry. There was a story of I think it was the Golden Gate Bridge, of a man who went through exactly that, but survived.
Survivors.
And
There's a couple of those.
right, so that does happen. And so, just to the question, I think that would meet Camus' standard. It would just be tragic. It would be to die unreconciled. And strangely, however, of one's free will. So that wouldn't be not quite getting what Camus was after. Albert Camus est mort. That's right. And there's more we can say. I want to jump to Nietzsche, though, so that we have some time here. Let me get your final question. Go ahead.
Do any animals commit suicide?
I don't think so.
Committed suicide.
What's that?
I know a dog that committed suicide.
You sure?
Yeah.
How?
So there was this one dog, and it was snowing outside, and my ex's family forgot to make sure that he was inside, and then snow fell on top of him, and then he died. And then the next day, the brother was like so distraught about the brother's death that he sat next to like his little snow mound, and then wouldn't come back inside.
This is another dog?
And then snowfall on top of that one, and he died
Oh.
on purpose.
Well, okay. That's hard to establish. The mourning, I think it's interesting. That animals seem to mourn. Dogs in particular will go to their owners, their whatever, gravesite, and not leave even for food. To call that suicide may be a bit much. I think I would have to... I don't know that I would call it suicide. I would say this is a really tight connection to that other creature, that other being. That's something Camus probably wouldn't have considered. But calling it suicide is a little different.
But what about how like people who actually commit suicide aren't even like they're not trying to die, they're just like tired of living?
That's where Camus is unclear. Is he how many people are really saying, oh my God, there's absolutely no meaning with a capital M, truth with a capital T, therefore why do I continue? And clinically, that's rarer at least than I particularly don't feel connected to others. I particularly don't have a meaning for my particular existence. And that's why when people feel that, and it's so overpowering that they don't feel anything can solve that problem other than ending their lives, I think we mentioned this last time, that feeling, as strong as it is temporary. And when, in the sense, at least this is the clinical understanding of it, and then that's why in hospitals they are forced to stay for 3 days where that passes. Real quick, yeah.
I also feel like ending your life feels like a choice that's a lot harder and takes more will to do than just living, because and I feel like the sort of existential crisis that would arise from recognizing like the absurd and stuff. I feel like it's more likely to end in like a paralysis and like an inability to make any choices than like to make the choice.
Yeah, I guess the fundamental disagreement is with his use of Sisyphus as an example. That's a man of action almost entirely until the boulder goes back down. Then there's that moment of lucid consciousness. That is the awareness of the situation. But it's not a paralysis. He doesn't just stay there saying, oh my God. He thinks that's the idea, that's the goal. And it's hard to maintain that tension of being a person of action, but also contemplative enough that you're not just lying to yourself and just sort of dismissing and becoming, as Sartre would say, pure facticity, which is to say, just a being without any choices, without any intelligence, without any, what Sartre would say again, transcendence. Real quick.
I was just going to say, it takes a lot of different things in a situation like that. To choose to go through it and to live your life takes a lot of different stuff than it would take to get you to commit suicide.
Yeah, this is tough, and I don't think Camus covers. He certainly doesn't cover the gamut of this issue. I mean, there are many, many reasons why people consider ending their lives, and one of the best ways of avoiding this is keeping easy access to allowing it to happen and creating connections and maintaining connections. I mean, Camus mentions one instance of a person who something horrible had happened to him years before, but the accumulation of these experiences just made him feel undermined, is the word that he used. And sometimes you don't know. Sometimes you don't know that all it takes is just reaching out to that person or responding to that person's call or cry or what have you. And sometimes that's sufficient. Sometimes it isn't. Okay, well, we're going to end discussion of Camus unreconciled, as he would want, and jump into Nietzsche as quickly as we can. But before I do that, I need to, I missed, let's see, did Logan come in? Did Logan come in? No? Ella? No, Jacob did.
Yep.
Brandon? Linda? Chase? Okay. I get everyone else? All right. So you did have a reading for today. It was Friedrich Nietzsche. I'm a little bit behind, so let me just do very quickly your discussions on maybe break into different groups than you have been before, at least another group for get into groups of 4 or whatever. Just briefly discuss your reading from Nietzsche. All right, I apologize. Oh, just cut you off there. Let's get to Friedrich. Freddie. Friends called him Freddie, probably. Or Fritz. More likely Fritz. This was, I think, probably the hardest philosopher's last name to spell in all of the history of philosophy. I know of no other more difficult name to spell. I could be mistaken. Maybe you have an example.
5 consonants in a row.
It's incorrect. It's not right. It's the title of the paper, On Truth and Lies, in a non-moral sense. It's sometimes translated as extra-moral, which doesn't make any sense to me. I don't know why it's translated that. Non-moral just means amoral, ultimately. That's typically how it's translated. Extra-moral sounds like it's really moral.
What about extramarital?
Or it could mean that in the sense of it's not part of the marriage. It's extramarital. Wait, what does extramarital mean? Like an extramarital affair?
Yeah.
Is that the sense of it?
Outside marriage.
Yeah, that's like in addition to my marriage, I'm also having this relationship. It's extra. Yeah, so that's what I think that's why it's sometimes translated as that. So there's moral, which is good, immoral, which is bad, amoral or non-moral, or extra-moral, which is not having to do with morality or something like that. Let me say a little bit about the man. There he is, handsome fellow back then. Before the syphilis hit, he did have some problems with syphilis around 1890, and then he had a whole decade of just illness, where he was the most productive. It's quite fascinating. He did teach for a bit. He did get a little bit. He was worse in some ways than Wittgenstein with respect to the students. I don't think he ever hit the students as Wittgenstein did, and he certainly didn't teach young kids like Wittgenstein did. But his lectures got more and more convoluted, and he didn't care about the students. He didn't care about teaching. He didn't want to do that. And then eventually the sickness, which it was syphilis, did eventually hit him. He did, however, have a kind of brilliance about him, very similar to Wittgenstein insofar as achieving a PhD and getting to teach without having to do a whole lot of work before that. Wittgenstein had his Tractatus, which counted as his dissertation. Nietzsche had written a number of things dealing with, for instance, the genealogy of morals and morality. Is very much interested in that, which we'll return to when we get to the philosophy of religion section. But he was basically given, he didn't even have his PhD at the age of 24, but he was getting it. And he was offered a job as the chair of the department. This is unheard of. This has never happened. I don't think it's ever happened since. And he was just seen as that brilliant. And he began teaching for about 10 years or so. He did have an interesting upbringing. He was sometimes called the little pastor because his dad was a pastor who died when he was young, and Nietzsche was brought up by his female siblings and his mother and grandmother, so he was surrounded by women, which is interesting. There are, when taken out of context, and also taken in context, what seem to be misogynistic writings, also anti-Semitic writings when taken out of context. And sometimes the context is like, well, that does sound anti-Semitic. I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But he was hard to pin down. To say that Nietzsche felt this way or believed this, there wasn't consistency in his writing. As you know, some of you may know, and as you know from existentialism generally, this isn't a kind of systematic theorizing that he's going to be engaged in. And as one person put it on, advice on how to write about Nietzsche, Nietzsche is the most sarcastic son of a bitch ever to set foot on this earth. Just say that, then write whatever else you want, like he would. I don't know if that's quite accurate in representing Nietzsche. He wasn't a bullshit artist. In fact, he was very much interested in conceptions of truth, but with a lowercase t. Truths, in fact, might be a better term. Truths is the word he would use. And he talks about lying and truth, of course, in the reading that you had for today. And we'll remind ourselves about this concept of bullshit, too, as it relates. So there's Nietzsche. He's over here with a squirrely face. This is a rare instance of people smiling. I think they're smiling. It's hard to tell. This is Paul Rée, a good friend of Nietzsche, and here's Lou Salome, who Nietzsche loved. Should have had hearts or something going over them. And Nietzsche asked Paul Rée, hey, go tell Lou that I love her. Something like that. He passed a note to him. Pretty sure that's how it went down. And Paul said, all right, I'll do it. And she said no, and then they fell in love. And so that was damaging to this guy. That did not help him. Kierkegaard has a similar experience, as we'll see. Later, upon Nietzsche's death, when he had achieved a certain amount of fame, after his death, by the way, not during his lifetime, Lou claimed that he had offered his hand in marriage. What's that called? Proposed. There's no evidence of that having happened, but it's just interesting.
Before, after the syphilis.
This is before. That's before. This is not a syphilitic face right there. I'll show you one later. All right. Yay. Sorry. There he is with his face. He was often talked about nihilism. He's often accused of being a nihilist. Well, maybe, but that's a confusion. He was against nihilistic thinking, in particular Christianity, which he accused of being anti-life, anti-this life, in a way that influenced Camus that we talked about already. This hope for the afterlife, which may or may not happen, sees this life as less than. And again, he doesn't make a whole lot of arguments, right, in the straightforward way that you might want. Camus doesn't either. And in response, we can borrow from Carl Sagan, claims presented without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. And so if one doesn't like the idea that we shouldn't have hope for the afterlife, or that there is no evidence for the afterlife, or there's no arguments for the afterlife, we might simply respond with, yes, there are, Camus. Yes, there are, Nietzsche. You're wrong. God isn't dead. We haven't killed him. That's jumping ahead, sorry. That would have been an amusing bit of words there if we had read Nietzsche's philosophy of religion yet, which we haven't. He was not a nihilist in that way. In fact, he's attacking nihilism of any viewpoint, including systematic abstract science, that dismisses the importance of this life in this moment. And was he a Nazi? That's complex. Well, of course he wasn't a Nazi, because there weren't Nazis yet. So he wouldn't have been a Nazi. And the Nazi Party did take some of his writings, that's true, and say, we like the idea of the Übermensch, we like the idea of his anti-Semitism, which was clear when taken out of context, taken out of chronological order, and then misused by Nietzsche's sister Elizabeth, who was married to a proto-Nazi, who eventually became a member of the Nazi Party. After Nietzsche's death, she edited much of his works, in particular his Will to Power, and made that thing look like the centerpiece of the Nazi party. Nietzsche would not have liked this. Nietzsche would have been extremely upset about this. Here you find Hitler staring, I don't know, pensively at the bust of Nietzsche. I don't know that Hitler read too much of Nietzsche, but whatever he did, it was probably the Will to Power that was edited strongly by the sister Elizabeth. Here's what he might have said about the Nazi Party. As long as there have been human beings, there have also been herds of men. The term herd mentality goes back to Kierkegaard. Clans, communities, tribes, people, states, churches, and always a great many people who obeyed, compared with the small number of those commanding. It may fairly be assumed that the need for herding together is now innate in the average man. He would look at the average Nazi. He would look at Adolf Eichmann. He would look at Hitler as the average man, I think. In fact, he was fond of Wagner, And I got to throw some German cuss words in. I said fick dich earlier. Fick dich. Anyway, that says fuck you, Wagner. What? But I'm an Übermensch. Nietzsche really was fond of Wagner, thought his music, his creativity, his operas were sort of pushing this conception of the Übermensch, the Superman, the Overman that we'll see later on. And then I think partly because of Wagner's clear and incessant anti-Semitism, and for some other reasons, Nietzsche broke ties with him. And basically, this is a rare instance of him holding a sword in the military. So let's get to the reading. I'm sorry for all the background. I'll say more about Nietzsche when we get into his philosophy of religion. We have a little bit more time. This image, I think, represents part of Nietzsche's concern. This is the Caspar David Friedrich, the Polar Sea, which shows technology at the time, which shows reason, which shows industriousness of human creativity getting destroyed by nature. Too much faith in science. I don't want to say he's against science. Nietzsche is not. He's against scientism, for sure, although I don't think that term was around at the time. This conception of objective rationality, inevitable progress through such things as capitalism, such things as the Enlightenment type of thinking, is a concern for Nietzsche. He's not one of these people who blindly attacks the Enlightenment. He's not a romantic philosopher in that sense. He's kind of more like Foucault. In fact, Foucault follows, as we'll see at the end, Nietzsche's conception of finding a kind of balance between what he'll call the Apollonian spirit and the Dionysian spirit. The Apollonian is the reason, the rational, the Socratic, and the Dionysian is the creative, energetic, spirited. Dostoevsky's stupid man, but I don't think Descartes, I'm sorry, where the hell did Descartes come from? I don't think Nietzsche would like that. Maybe the word modernity got me. It's weird. So he starts off. Let's look at the reading. You all have the reading with you? Oh. Okay, well, if you don't have it with you, thank you. It's page 246, which is it's the first page. It's the first paragraph. He says, in some remote corner of the universe that is poured out in countless flickering solar systems, there once was a star, so this is sort of written after the fact, assuming, there once was a star on which clever animals invented knowledge. Let's put aside the fact that nobody thinks humans came from a star. We weren't on the star. So I think we'll give him some poetic license. Right? So don't attack him and say, wait a minute, that's not what scientists think. We didn't evolve on a star. Nobody thought that? I'm engaging a straw man here. Sorry. That was the most arrogant and most untruthful moment in world history. Yet indeed only a moment after nature had taken a few breaths, the star froze over and the clever animals had to die. So he's talking about us and our arrogance in thinking that we're amazing. And here we are in the universe, somewhere over there. That's our galaxy. It's one of billions of galaxies. And what is it that we do? We invented truth. Or, more arrogantly, we have the truth. Where do we get the truth? He goes on. There's too many quotable things in this paper, so I'm just going to read the whole thing. With some gaps. But if we could communicate with the gnat, the gnat, why is there a G before that N? It makes teaching children how to read so difficult. What's a gnat? It's a stupid language, that's what I tell them. English is a stupid language. And in fact, language is important here. Because what is it that language is doing? It's creating concepts for us. And what are the concepts doing? Abstracting away from our actual experiences. So language is a medium. Maybe we can't escape it. Maybe there's nothing better. Although Nietzsche likes the idea of art as a response. But he says, but if we could communicate with the gnat, we would learn that it too swims through the air with this same pathos, which sounds like he knows something about the gnat. I don't know how he knows this much. And feels within itself the flying center of this world. Nothing in nature is so contemptible and insignificant that it would not immediately be swollen up like a balloon by the slightest touch of that power of knowledge. And just as every cargo carrier wants to have his admirer, so too the proudest of man, the proudest man of all, the philosopher, which, that's him, by the way, he's aware of that, believes he sees the eyes of the universe focused telescopically from all directions upon his actions and thoughts. as if from a God's eye perspective. What perspective do we have? What perspective can we possibly have? I'm going to skip through this. Is there a view that does not presuppose subjectivity? To put it in the terms of this phrase that comes from Thomas Nagel, who's an analytic philosopher, but writes a lot about meaning and purpose, and the absurd, in fact, from an analytic perspective. It's an interesting crossover. I might have done well to have included it in the class. He also has a paper called What is it like to be a bat? This is Nietzsche, What is it like to be a gnat? Ooh, there's a great title of a paper in there somehow. Nietzsche and Nagel.
Nietzsche and the giant gnat.
You know what? Write that down. I like that. I'm going to think that through. I don't have an idea for a paper, but I do have a title now. Nietzsche and the giant gnat. Wait, as opposed to something in the giant peach. Yeah. Brilliant. Hell, that is great. I got to go write that paper now. There's some way of connecting the bat and the gnat. I'm wasting time here. So religion thinks it's the God. I'm not wasting time. Those are actually good ideas. Religion thinks it's the God's eye view. Science thinks it's the disinterested, objective view. Nietzsche thinks both of that, all of that is nonsense. There is no such perspectiveless perspective. Do you see the contradiction when you put it that way? You need to broaden your perspective. You need to get an objective perspective. What's that mean? That means a perspective from no one and from nowhere. Or from God's perspective. He doesn't believe in God, of course, as we've already mentioned, and we'll come back to that later. But there is no disinterested, neutral, objective viewpoint. What would that be? Could we even conceive of that? Go ahead.
I think I can.
Okay.
Because you can look at your own life like you're watching TV, or at least I can. When I look at my past actions,
Yeah.
I look at it through as little bias. Obviously, we all have biases,
Yeah.
So I don't believe that there's a full-blown perspectiveless perspective, but maybe a relative emotionless perspective.
Oh,
so
yeah.
you can conceive what you're doing as either logically right or wrong.
Yeah, he does talk about that, and he doesn't invoke Apollonian and Dionysian yet, but he uses that language. And at the very end, he's going to seemingly side with the intuitive person, not the rational who tries to be objective, because he thinks that person is lying. And they're engaged in what Sartre will call self-deception, but in a different way than Sartre calls than Sartre's interested in with bad faith. Yes.
Can you look on any matter of fact as an objective or an objective perspective, like saying 1 + 1 = 2? Wouldn't that be objective, or any scientific fact? Or is
That's what you think. Sorry. Yes. Doesn't that sound like an a perspectiveless perspective? It's still a perspective. It's from the mathematical perspective, and it's comprised of concepts, of ones and twos. And we're back to Frege and concept building. And Frege thinks that we can come to understand the world from our concepts and narrowly define things based upon those concepts. Nietzsche thinks that's going the wrong direction. What we end up doing is having immediate experiences that, as Camus says, we do understand and have a kind of immediacy and certainty to them. But then we try to generalize, we try to universalize, we try to say, all leaves are this. But in order to make the all claim, the abstract universal claim, we have to forget about the differences, we have to forget about the individual instances, we have to forget about the things that he says ultimately matter. Now, we may not agree with him. We may say, no, you're just confusing science. You're confusing what science is, you're confusing what mathematics is, you're confusing what concept formation is. But let's see what he has to say about this. So next time, if you'll have to leave, remember, I'm not going to be here. There'll be a sub, but there'll be group work. Make sure you do the Sartre, and the slides are posted for Sartre. I missed another. Did you have a comment earlier?
Is he saying that like objectivity in general does not exist, and that all objectivity is really just subjectivity because it's from a human's perspective?
From an individual's perspective. And any attempt at universalizing that individual's perspective inevitably forgets difference.
But like all things are subjective on like kind of a technicality because they come from us. because we created them?
Yes,
Because like,
yes.
I can objectively say, oh, that's leaning against the wall.
Yeah.
But then isn't that also subjective because it's my
Oh.
perspective that's saying that?
Well,
Or-
he's broadening it out. He wants to broaden it out more. He doesn't. He does focus sometimes on specific instances, but I think more to the point where he talks about the game of dice on page 251. Within this game of dice, however, truth means to use each die as designated, count its spots accurately, forming the correct labels, and never violating the caste system and sequence of rank classifications. In other words, once we have that system set up in the rules, we have our concepts set up that have been established linguistically. Now it's objective. And he's right. That part's objective. There's a truth of the matter. But we've forgotten how that game, to borrow from Wittgenstein, who borrows from Nietzsche, was initially established. It's kind of like saying, you got to follow the rule. You're playing baseball. Baseball, when you get into it, you even watch the World Series, you're like, that's a strike. That's an absolute strike. That's objectively true. That's a fact of nature. No, the whole game is a construction. Baseball doesn't exist outside of humans deciding to play stickball. Right? And we define what a strike is. We define that 3 strikes equal 1 being out. We define an inning being over after 3 out. All of that is objective in the epistemic sense. Nietzsche, I think, has no trouble with that. But it's that we've forgotten, and life is a game in this way, that we have forgotten that we came up with the concepts. We are more like architectural geniuses than discoverers. Do you see the difference? He talks about the bees. The bees are amazing, but we're better than bees? No, we construct out of our self-made concepts. The bees are constructing out of things that are already there. We are inventing truth. We are building truth. That is not the same thing as discovering it. And even in mathematics, ask your math teachers, and I asked you this before, do we discover mathematical theorems or do we invent them? And the answer is both. Nietzsche would be more along the lines of, no, they're all invented. You've invented irrational numbers, for example. And he says, and this in fact takes us back to Thomas Nagel, I mentioned him already, and William James. James agrees here with Nietzsche, it seems. I don't know that James read any Nietzsche, and I don't know that Nietzsche read any James. I don't think he did. What you want is a philosophy that will not only exercise your powers of intellectual abstraction, but that will make some positive connection with this actual world of finite human lives. That could very easily have come right out of Nietzsche. And yet Nietzsche and James are so very different philosophers. Purely objective truth plays no role whatsoever, is nowhere to be found, as James puts it. There is no such thing as a disinterested truth. Where does he go? Where's the key line? Where is it? Oh, there are too many lines. There are too many good things here. We're play acting before others and before oneself. Here we go, page 248. And furthermore, what is the situation with those conventions of language? Are they perhaps products of knowledge, of the sense for truth? Do terms coincide with things? This is a fundamental question in the philosophy of language. Is language the adequate expression of all realities? Only by forgetfulness can we ever come to believe that we have truth to the above designated degree. Unless we want to settle for truth in the form of a tautology of empty husks, we will perpetually exchange truths for illusions. What is a word? The portrayal of nerve stimuli in sounds. But to conclude from a nerve stimulus to a cause outside ourselves is already the result of a false and unjustified application of the law of causality. And he continues, what would allow us, if the truth about the origin of language, the viewpoint of the certainty of terms, were alone decisive, what would allow us to say, the stone is hard, as if hard were known to us otherwise than as a subjective stimulation? All things start with particular individual stimulations that are relevant to individual things, but then we use language that are unconnected to things particularly. They are metaphors. We've left the realm of things themselves, as he says on 249, let us think in particular of the formation of concepts. Every word becomes a concept as soon as it is supposed to serve not merely as a reminder, and here are the key terms that he finds important, of the unique, absolutely individualized, original experience. That's gone, he thinks, with language. Oh, there's too much. Let me get one more thing. What is truth? It is a mobile army of metaphors, metonyms, like all hands on deck is a metonym. Anthropomorphisms, in short, it is the sum of human relations which were poetically and rhetorically heightened, transferred, and adorned, and after long use seem solid, canonical, and binding to a nation. In other words, the rules of baseball seem like they've always been that way, and then they're canonical. We just have to accept it. We fail to recognize and remember that indeed we pretty much invented all of this. As he says, I can't find that line now. I want to say more. I want to introduce Sartre here before I leave. But on 250, everything that sets man off from the animal depends upon this capacity to dilute the concrete metaphors into a schema. Schema is a kind of abstraction. Animals don't think, he thinks, in abstractions, in universals. They think instinctively, intuitively, bodily, in fact. He says on 251, one of my favorite lines in the whole thing, he says, as an architectural genius, man excels the bee. For the bee builds out of wax, which it collects from nature, while man builds out of the much more delicate material of the concepts, which he must fabricate out of his own self. In this respect, he is quite admirable, but not because of his desire for truth, for pure knowledge of things. If someone hides an object behind a bush, then seeks and finds it there, that seeking and finding is not very laudable. And yet this, he thinks, is how we establish truth. As if we discover it. It's not. That's a lie. We've forgotten that. That's a lie. We build it up through our concept formation, and we've forgotten the origins of our initial experiences. There's too many other. I have actually way more quotes that I want to talk about. Who wants? Bless. Did you? I won't be here Wednesday. So what I want you to do. There's a wonderful quote on 252, only by forgetting that the primitive metaphor world, only the hardening and rigidification, and on it goes. Fantastic stuff. Whether or not you agree with it is different. Does he get science correct? Aren't you correct that we can make objective, non-arbitrary, non-purely subjective interpretations of reality? And can we do so without being accused of lying? Of lying to ourselves, of being accused of bad faith. What we'll do is, for next time, you do have a reading. It's a long reading and it's a difficult reading, but I want you to focus on the concept of bad faith and its distinction between that and lying and these other concepts. These slides are available to you. You can look at them now. I have a lot I want to say about this. There's even some dancing. That's awesome. Some of the central concepts that we're going to be getting at. You'll look at these slides first. It'll be hard because they're not going to be explanations of them, although some of the slides do have arguments. For instance, here, there's an argument for his concept of freedom, which is essential and is in the background of being in nothingness. If you can't read the whole thing, which is a likelihood, note page 47 to 49 and 55 to 63. In fact, it may be fruitful. Start with the slides, which again are available to you, and then go to those particular page numbers in the reading. Maybe print just those page numbers out, or at least have access to that reading for class on Wednesday. You'll have two things. You'll have a reflection on Sartre, and you're going to have some group work on it as well. So that's two assignments. You definitely want to be here for those. Reminding you again, this is a difficult reading, but start with the slides. I think it'll help a little bit. And some of this PowerPoint slides on Sartre. Did I say start? Start. Jean-Paul Sartre. Yeah, got it. Look at the slides first. We've seen some of the things that he's already talked about, some of these concepts we've looked at before. Okay, take care. Have a good one. It's been a while. I appreciate it.
Have a good day.
When Nietzsche talks about the master-slave morality and
Yeah.
will to power and the last man, it seems to me like he's imposing some kind of value structure on the universe.
Yes.
Because,
That's his
presumably
perspective.
you wouldn't want to be the last man. Presumably you'd want to be the master, not the slave.
Well, it depends. The last man is perhaps on the tightrope in between humans and the Ubermensch. So the last man is kind of in that in-between position. We'll talk about all of that and this perspectivism is kind of the grounding
What
of
would
it.
Camus think about that?
Oh, well, Camus. I thought you said Nietzsche.
Yeah, I was. But I was saying, it seems like the presentation you were talking about was like Camus and Nietzsche kind of had a lot in similar
Yes.
because they had that existentialist perspective. But it seems like, I don't know, would Camus agree with the idea of the Ubermensch and stuff?
That's a good question. Not necessarily in Nietzsche's conception of it. I don't think he'd have a problem with it. I mean, with respect to the point of life and living, an Ubermensch might simply be someone who is capable of making one's life aesthetic. In fact, the artist, like Goethe, is one of, or Goethe, is one of Nietzsche's, ideals, so to speak. Whereas making an art out of one's life, being creative, and here you find Camus saying one should live dangerously or create dangerously. That sounds similar to Nietzsche's conception of the Ubermensch, certainly of his conception of Goethe. So I think Camus would ultimately agree with that. And both of them have a similar conception of responding to death. In fact, Nietzsche says, I didn't get this, where is it? The existence of the world is justified only as an aesthetic phenomenon, one that seduces us to the continuation of life, which is different than saying, hey, there's an objective answer to the existence of life. It's more of art is what keeps us alive. If there were no music, he says, life would be a joke at one point. So but all of that, all those themes, everything you mentioned, we'll return to in the philosophy of religion section.
Okay.
So we'll have a more
I think
full
I got
answer
the
to that.
last man wrong then, because I remembered something about Nietzsche where it was like the society was full of people who all had very negative, pathetic values, and there was like one person who stood in opposition to them. I thought that was the last man, but I might be
We'll talk about that
misremembering
with the
it.
reevaluation of all values. That's going to come up
Okay.
because the value section.
In this class or in?
Oh yeah, in this
okay.
class, and maybe the philosophy of religion. I don't know. Are you going to take that?
I might.
Okay,
I'm
then
gonna see.
then it definitely will be in if you want more of that.
All right, thank you.
Have a good.
Good luck in your
Thank you.
whatever it is.
Conference, yeah.
Texas, yeah.
Good luck in Texas. One should always be given that. That's a good point.
Don't get shot.
Oh, good Lord.
I just wanted to apologize for coming in late and seeing if I got on roll.
Don't worry about that. Did you get a reflection in?
Yeah.
Okay, so you get the partial credit for that, but we did the reflection. Oh, were you here
No,
for the?
I was here for the reflection.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
Because I started it
Started
late.
late, I got lucky.
I thought I got you. Come on. I will mark you here.
Rad. Yeah, I'm good.
Oh, I got you.
Just
Good.
making sure. Thank you.
Uh-huh.
I'm good.
I guess I'm interested in like the idea of intuition, and I'm wondering if you have any philosophers you recommend that specifically speak about what that is, because I feel like it can be difficult to get a grasp on.
It has a long history. In some, let's see, where's a good place to start? Well, Sartre. We'll talk about intuition with Sartre. And Nietzsche has a different conception of intuition, which is kind of more bodily. So Nietzsche's a good one to look for. I think, let's see, gosh. Yeah, Sartre with his philosophy of emotions might talk about it there. Kant talks about intuitions in a different way. Space-time are intuitions that are, to borrow from Nietzsche, that we construct reality. We bring space and time to experience. So Kant, on his theories of intuition, would be one. And then actually in psychology, Nobel Peace Prize winner Daniel Kahneman, in his book Thinking Fast and Slow, he gives a definition of intuition that makes a lot of sense. It's not magical. It's I'm able to come to an immediate answer to something because I have expertise. I've built up my 10,000 hours of training, And now I see, that painting is a fraud. How do you know that? I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure it's a fraud. I don't know how to put it into words. That's an intuition, but it's not magical. So
I've heard that in terms of like a sociological sort of perspective.
sociological, okay, but certainly psychological. So Daniel Kahneman would be Kahneman, Kahn. I don't know how to spell it.
Okay, I can find it.
Thinking Fast and Slow is the book.
Okay, cool. Okay, thank you.
Uh huh.